Today we're going to be interviewing Rick Bradford. Some of you might know him as William Collins. He's the author of The Empathy Gap, which is a remarkable work, masses and masses of wonderful information. I was looking at it last weekend, and if you want to find anything out about some of the issues that we're discovering are so complicated and difficult, then I would definitely recommend going to Rick's resources, because he knows so much about all the kinds of things that we're talking about. So let's get started.
Good to talk to you.
It's lovely to talk to you too. And you've got so many roles, but I was going to ask you first of all to talk to us a little bit about your trusteeship, because you are a trustee of a very interesting charity that's discovering a lot about men's issues. And I'll leave it to you to introduce some information about that.
Yes, that's right. I've been volunteering for about 3 or 4 years, and about a year ago became a trustee of the charity Families Need Fathers, Both Parents Matter, Cymru, which is a bit of a mouthful. So we tend to call it just Both Parents Matter, or BPM for short. But it's a Welsh charity, as the name gives away. We operate almost entirely in Wales, so we do take a few referees from England as well. And people might be more familiar with the English charity FNF, Families Need Fathers. So we're a sort of Welsh sister charity. So our main raison d'etre is to provide support to non-resident parents, almost invariably over child contact, child arrangement issues. However, we, like many people, are very well aware of the relationship between parental separation, child contact, and private law family law cases, the relationship between those and domestic abuse. And so a couple of years ago, we started a separate wing to the charity, which is to act as a specialist provider of support specifically to male victims of domestic abuse. So as far as the main service of the charity is concerned, which is support to non-resident parents, we do support parents of both sexes, both fathers and mothers. But of course, non-resident parents overwhelmingly are men. So in practice, 95%, 96% of our service users are men. And as regards domestic abuse, it's specifically exclusively men that we support, because there's no point in going into competition with the likes of Women's Aid over that issue for women.
I think, am I right to think that you've collected a lot of information about your members, about the in relation to domestic abuse, for example? Is that right?
Yes, that's right. We have been doing for a number of years, but we really got our act together about 18 months or so back, around about September 2019, when we did a couple of things. We first of all started using an online system for our caseworker files. So we've got everything in one place, whereas before we had lever arch files of paperwork, which was a bit incomprehensible to get to grips with. But also what we started doing then is we introduced a standard 6-page service user pack, which allows us to collect data, the same set of data, a consistent set of data from every service user that registers with us. And we have, generally say about 500 new registrants per year. It was probably about 400 last year, but the rate is accelerating.
So what kind of information what kind of information are you gathering then?
It breaks down, I suppose, into 4 parts. The first part is sort of very basic contact details and yes/no questions about the family law case that they almost invariably have. So that's the simple stuff. And if you phone the helpline, for example, the material they will collect from you on the helpline is limited to that. But then we go, generally the way we work is we then have, if somebody registers with us, we then have an outbound call. So somebody from the charity will phone them for a much longer consultation, which typically takes about an hour over the phone. So that goes into, of course, the details of the case. And that's where it varies with the service users. Sometimes they're very effusive and you can't shut them up. Other times you have to drag information out of them. But you have to, because we're all about providing practical support. Well, there's two parts to the charity: practical support and emotional support. But on the practical side, you want to know the facts of the issue. So rather like a solicitor would want to know the facts of the issue. So that part of it is all about delving into the case and what they really need and focusing them on a constructive approach. So you might encourage them to write some sort of parenting plan and write down in very simple bullet point form what they really want to get in a realistic way from the case without just banging the table and saying non-constructive things like, I want to see the kids, which of course they all say. But there's two other parts to it, which we may well be unique in terms of men's charities in doing this, or predominantly men's charities, in that we put all our registrants through the standard domestic abuse risk indicator checklist. So this is the standard checklist that's used in the women's sector, is developed in the women's sector. So it used to be called the CARDA Dash checklist. It's now the Safe Lives checklist. So it's a standard set of 24 questions. We ask exactly the same questions, apart from one question, which I think I can't remember the exact words, but in the women's version, it asks, have you been pregnant, I think, over the last year? Well, that's obviously not appropriate for men. So we changed that slightly to, have you had a baby? That is, obviously, has your partner had a baby in that period? Yeah. So other than that very slight tweak, it's identical to the questions that women get asked.
What kind of information are you getting from that?
Well, it's extremely interesting, and particularly when you relate it to the last bit of the data we collect. Because the last bit is we ask our service users, we put them through two standard psychology questionnaires aimed at quantifying mental well-being and social and emotional isolation, commonly called loneliness. So we've now got a lot of data. Many hundreds of service users have completed all that. So we can play tunes on that in terms of looking at the relationship between the psychology results and the risk indicator results. So that's interesting. So let me give you some basic stats first. I've said how many service users we register, but you have to bear in mind throughout everything I'm saying that this isn't a random cross-section of the public. These are people who are undergoing parental separation, overwhelmingly men. They've almost invariably got live family court cases, which means there is some sort of contested issue, almost invariably over child contact. So that's the demographic we're looking at in terms of the background. But there's another aspect of the demographic in that more than half our service users are unemployed, and about 2/3 earn less than £12,000 a year, or have an income less than £12,000 a year. So it's also very skewed to that lower socioeconomic group, which has a bearing on things as well, I expect. Mm-hmm. So if I can sort of take you through some of the big picture statistics here. In terms of the domestic abuse issue, the surprising thing, and it will be more than surprising, I think it will be amazing to some people, bear in mind we ask everyone the question about domestic abuse. Well, we ask them first whether they've been the victims of domestic abuse, and some say yes and some say no. But irrespective of their answer to that, we take them through the Safe Lives risk indicator checklist, the 24 questions. And what we find is many men who say, no, I'm not a victim of abuse, turn out to be a victim of abuse when you actually take them through that checklist. And some of them are even in the high risk category.
Goodness.
So I've got a statistic here for the proportion of our service users that we reckon are victims, and that is based on either they self-report being victims or they score 10 or higher on the risk indicators. That's 10 out of 24. So 10 is moderately high, 14 is high. The answer is 71% meet that criterion. 71%.
And what sort of abuse, sorry, Rick, to interrupt you, what sort of abuse is the most prominent for men? Can you identify?
That's a very, very good question, which I was going to expose. And it's the answer, of course, is obviously that when it comes to our service users, there's one question 7, which is there conflict over child contact? Well, there's a selection bias here. It's not surprising that 93% answer yes. It's only surprising it isn't even more, because they're a self-selected group on that basis. So that actually means nothing. What is surprising, though, is the second highest, because the second highest is question 12, which is this: does the abuser try to control everything you do, and or are they excessively jealous? And the result there is 88%. 88%. Now, bear in mind, this is almost all men, with literally invariably, I think, in our data set, female partners or ex-partners who are featuring as the abuser in this context. So 88% answer yes to that question. It's the second highest after the child contact issue.
Is there any indication of age with that? Is a particular age group more commonly reporting that, or is it just across the board?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't tried correlating the answer to...
Something just happened to your microphone, I think.
Yeah, I haven't tried correlating individual questions with that, but our age range, I mean, I have a histogram of age range, and it peaks in the age range 34 to 39. That's where most of our service users are, but we cover all ranges. I mean, the youngest is 18 and the oldest is 84. So we do cover a huge, but of course there's not very many at 18 or above 65, let's say. So yeah, the correlation with age I haven't looked at, but
it just would be interesting to see the kind of generational differences, if there are any.
That's
I'd
true.
love to know.
That's true.
Yeah.
Now, I'm preparing another paper probably for publication later this year, in which I'm going to drill into the answers to individual RIC questions. That's the risk indicator checklist questions, and look at correlations with those. What I've done in an existing publication, though, is look at not the individual questions, but correlation of well-being and loneliness with the overall RIC score. And I've done that I've also tried to look at the correlation between well-being and loneliness with other aspects of data we collect, such as employment or disability and things of that sort. And what was very striking in that earlier piece of work that was published in December is that it is the correlation with, or the relationship with, the risk indicator checklist, the domestic abuse issue, which is easily the strongest. And that was quite a revelation.
Yeah.
One of the issues, Rick, that any skeptical person will probably raise is that self-report, without probing or without any kind of objective evidence to hang the answers around, prone to all sorts of biases and distortions. And I think a skeptical person would say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Because they're justifying their domestic abuse. In other words, because their partner behaves in an infuriating way and controlling and jealous, of course, that's why the domestic abuse is then triggered. So there's a problem with that, isn't there? Although, of course, you could say the other way around. That is that if people are questioning women victims of domestic abuse, their stats are also based on self-report, which will be equally prone to the same distortion. But is there any way of unpacking the information so as to try and work out what value to place on these answers?
Yeah, well, these are good questions, of course, and you're certainly right in principle. I mean, they are self-reports, and that's always going to be prone to some suspicion. But there's a number of responses to that. Firstly, it's the standard tool delivered in the same way and interpreted in the same way as is done in the women's sector. So in that sense, it's comparable. Another response is this is the tool that is accepted as being the methodology that would be used, for example, in evidencing for legal aid purposes, which is one of the things we use it for. But there's another powerful piece of evidence here in support of it not being as skewed as you might imagine. And part of this comes from people who take men through this risk indicator. They have to explain what the questions mean. Let me give you an example. There's one of the questions that relates to the use of weapons. And you might get a knee-jerk response, no, she's never used weapons. And then you have to say, weapon doesn't just mean a gun or a knife. It can mean anything. And you can get a response, and this is an actual case. Oh, would having a pint mug smashed on your head count? And this is a man that said no. Okay. So there may be a bias, but it may not be in the direction you think. So that's one thing, and you do come across this quite commonly. And I've already alluded to this in that many men will say they're not victims of abuse, but if you, I mean, I plotted the histogram of the RIC scores of men that say they're not victims of abuse against the histogram for everyone, or for those that say they are. And it's not that different. Yes, it's slightly skewed to the lower risks, but you still get plenty of men that are in the high risk category that said they weren't victims of abuse. And it's because of this phenomenon that they don't recognize it. It's quite remarkable.
Can I interrupt you again though, Rick? Because one of the features of the DAP program, for example, which the ones that originate in Duluth and take quite a challenging approach to men, is that the rationale behind them is that male domestic abuse is driven by patriarchal assumptions amongst men that they're entitled to be in control of female partners. And so that's presumably the response that you'd get, to say, well, these men just assume that their partners are going to be obedient and compliant, and the fact they're not as compliant and obedient as they should be is simply a demonstration of these men's patriarchal assumptions. Because that's a powerful ideology that's coming through with the kind of women activists, commenting on the domestic abuse situation. So how do we deal with that? I mean, I absolutely appreciate what you're saying about support from other questions, answers to other questions. But do you see a problem with this kind of argument that it's the patriarchy that gives men this unjustified assumption that they should be obeyed and get away with whatever they wish?
Well, does it apply to you, George? Are you a nasty, abusive patriarch who bases your relationship with women on power and control?
I'm going to be humble here and take a kind of Harry Windsor approach, which is you never know until some woke partner tells you so, and then you suddenly realise, of course, that it's a hidden It's a hidden pattern of behavior that you had never noticed in yourself before. But that hasn't happened to me yet. I haven't yet been woken from whatever lack of insight I have.
Well, of course, the data from our service users, I mean, it isn't really our charity's business to conduct psychology research. We've strayed into it because of the results that I've yet to show you in terms of well-being and loneliness. And they're interesting results because I think they're probably unique in the men's DV sector. So it's important to publish them, but I don't pretend to have gone into the broader issues. But just my knowledge of the domestic abuse research literature is such that it's known, actually, amongst researchers who do not come at it from an ideological perspective, that the power and control patriarchy theory only applies in a very small percentage of domestic abuse cases. It does occur, of course. There are men like that, but it's in single figures of percent that applies. It's not the typical ideology at all. And you mentioned Duluth. I mean, the fact that it's not the typical ideology is sort of demonstrated by the failure of Duluth to work, which is also well known. It's so well known that even the adherents of it are quietly pulling away from it. I know you've interviewed David Eggins and Denise Knowles on this topic, and they probably made, I think, a passing reference to the Drive project. Well, that, I think, is all about slowly pulling away from Duluth because it doesn't make sense. But this is all way beyond what the charity can tackle.
Of course, but it's an important source of information which is lacking anywhere else. And having hundreds of data points is tremendously valuable.
That's right. And the really interesting thing is when we get on to the well-being, the tests that really put numbers to what we already knew in dealing with these men. They don't all come to us in a completely destroyed state, but a lot of them do. So we've got two measures here. Let's start off with the loneliness one. So for the experts listening, we use the 11-point De Jong-Gervald scale for this, which measures both social and emotional isolation. And the big picture results are that only 18% of our service users are not lonely, only 18%. And that compares with between more than half to almost 2/3 of the general public would say they were not lonely. And then if you look at the other end, 36% of our service users are either severely lonely or very severely lonely, which has a prevalence in the general population of only 5%. So, 5%, and that is 5% are severely.
A third of these people are very, very lonely.
A bit more than a third. So it's extremely skewed, and it's very obvious when you ask the questions, that is going to come out that way. And this is a problem. It'll be a problem for women as well, but it's notoriously a particular problem for men because men tend to put all their emotional eggs in one basket. So when their family separation occurs, they lose all their social support at the very time they need it most. So social isolation is a major issue, and it's one of the things that we're trying to address more effectively in the charity. I did mention that the charity gives practical support, things like legal aid, applications, help with filling forms, concentrating people's minds on constructive approaches and all that, all the practical stuff. But we do also have an emotional support wing to the charity, what we call our buddy support group, where we have a member of staff who's the buddy coordinator and a team of volunteer buddies whose sole role is to essentially befriend people at the moment by phone. But hopefully when lockdowns end, we want to get more active in terms of social groups, things like going out for walks in the countryside and things like that, because breaking this social isolation is a major issue that we need to tackle. So that's the loneliness thing, and essentially the same sort of thing is reflected in the mental well-being scale. So here we use the shorter Warwick-Edinburgh scale, which is 7 questions. So it's scored, each scoring 1 to 5. So the score is from a low of 7 to a high of 35. And perhaps I can send you the graph later, but general populations have a beautiful normal distribution. Our service users have a log normal distribution, which, as you know, is skewed to low values. So 3/4 of our service users have mental well-being below average, and a staggering 28% score at a very low level, which has a prevalence in general populations of only 2%. And they'll be the same people in general that are displaying severe loneliness. I've correlated the 2 things, and the 2 things are very obviously anti-correlated.
And presumably suicidal.
That's one of the risks that we need.
Yes. We also ask, as part of the RIC, we ask people a question about, are you depressed or having suicidal thoughts? That's a standard RIC question. So we get 80% of our service users saying yes to that, but mostly that's depression. And given the circumstances they're in, that's not really surprising, because it isn't necessarily clinically diagnosed depression. People interpret that their own way. Some of it is clinically diagnosed, by the way, and quite a few of them are on medication. But we also follow that up with a subsidiary question, if we get an answer yes to that, to ask specifically about suicidality. So we ask them whether, you've actually been thinking about suicide, or have you in the recent past been thinking about suicide? So 24% of our service users say yes to that. 24% are either currently undergoing suicidal ideation or have in the recent past. And about 5%, I think it's 4.4% now, have actually attempted suicide.
It's 1 in 20.
So the risk...
1 in 20 have actually attempted suicide.
Approaching 1 in 20. Yeah. So these prevalence levels, if you know what the suicidality and suicide attempt prevalence is in the general population, I can't quote it offhand, but they're very, very small percentages. So these are way, 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 way higher. And it's not surprising, because we know that the things that drive suicide are, 1, being male, check. 2, parental separation, check, and child contact issues. And 3rd, being unemployed or employed in low-skilled manual labour. So our service users meet all 3 criteria. Oh, and the other thing is men in middle age, and most of our men are 30s to 40s. So we tick all the boxes. So if you ever want the demographic, if you want a sample of people where suicidality peaks, we have it.
And of course, men express their distress in ways that are different from women. I mean, if one can generalize, but I think there is a difference in that the population prevalence of depression is much higher in women, lifetime risk of depression much higher in women. But in men, the equivalent is often regarded as alcoholism and other dysfunctional behaviors which express themselves more aggressively rather than withdrawing and becoming helpless. Men tend to lash out, or at least that's the risk.
Yes, that's right. And so there is the risk that our socially isolated and depressed men turn to alcohol and drugs. And that does happen to some degree, and I'm sure it happens. We don't measure that, by the way, but I'm sure it must happen to a greater degree than in the general public. It's virtually inevitable. So you're right. I mean, it is well known, isn't it, in the psychology literature, that men tend towards externalizing behaviors, and women to internalizing behaviors. Yeah, as symptoms. Yeah, that's right.
Do you consider...
The other interesting... Sorry, Jill, carry on.
Do you consider the impact of the family court proceedings on these men, the way in which the process evolves?
We don't gather data on that. I mean,
No.
informally we know, of course, and we know because service users keep coming back to us. You know, they don't come along for some advice. We advise them, they fill in the forms and go away, and we never see them again. Well, a lot of them we never see again. We don't necessarily know what happens to them, but some come back a few months later or even a few years later when they find that court orders haven't been obeyed or there's some other issue arisen. So yeah, and of course we have done, not with our service users, but we used to run annually something we called the Welsh Dad Survey. We haven't done it for a few years now, but that was a survey of anyone that was a father in Wales, so not necessarily even people that had been involved with the family courts. But that did ask questions about your experience with children's services, your experience with Cafcass Cymru, and so on, experience with the police, etc., etc. And from what I recall of those results, Cafcass Cymru and the social workers of Cafcass Cymru got the worst crits of any category we ask questions about. So we know that there's a huge issue there. Yeah. We currently have a campaign to raise a petition with the Welsh Parliament to propose legislation to make recording of social workers with parents when they're interviewed in the context of child arrangement, to make recording compulsory. Right. To make it a statutory obligation, as it is with police interviews of suspects, for example. I mean, no one would dream of saying it was okay for police to question suspects without a recording these days, would they? No. But prior to, when was it, 1985, they did, of course, and people accepted it.
Yeah.
But there's no reason. I put together a definitive, what I modestly call the definitive case in favour of that recording recently, and there's really no downside other than if you want the opportunity to spin things your way.